Welcome to the Better Together podcast, where we look at ways where we can help each other as we minister, trying to follow the Lord and serve Him, and we do that together. Today we have Dr. Barry Raper. He is the Pastoral Ministry Program Coordinator at Welch College. He has a BS degree from Welch. He has an MDiv from Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, as well as a DMin degree from that seminary as well. And he's been teaching at Welch College since 2006. So welcome, Dr. Raper. It's so good to have you here with us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, you are working really on the front lines with a lot of our pastors, and you're trying to help them. You're trying to prepare them as they're going to go out into ministry. Share with us a bit, if you can, about what we can do to help equip our pastors, those of us in our local churches and lay folks that might be listening. What can we do to help folks, men that are called into the ministry, to prepare themselves?
Well, I don't know if this is going to answer the question, but I hope it does. I talked a little bit this summer at the National about kind of demystifying the call to ministry.
Yes.
There's a subjective side for people being called, to be pastors, but I think sometimes we've emphasized that maybe a bit too much. If that makes sense.
Yes.
And we haven't come alongside young guys to kind of say, have you considered that the Lord might be calling you? We're so afraid that we're going to be the voice of God that we just wait for guys to answer the call. And I think we need to be more proactive and intentional for developing not just young men, but men of all ages. There's such a need, as you know, in the denomination. We have a shortage, I think, of pastors. And
Yes, you're
so
correct.
I just think demystifying the call a little bit. I don't even know if that's a word.
Well, we can try to make it one.
Yeah.
So let's think about this for a bit. Every state has 5 to 8 vacancies right now, about 5 to 8 churches that need a pastor. I had a church that's not one of our churches, but they say we are doctrinally Free Will Baptist. So what do we do? And you get involved in the association and such. Well, would you send us a pastor? In other words, they were Free Will Baptist because they thought they could get a pastor that way. So there is just a large need for pastors, and if we think about the number of churches that we have and how many of them need pastors, does that mean that God has not called these people into the ministry? I think that's what you're saying.
Yes, sir. And in part, my experience when I went to Bible college was I always heard you should never go back and pastor your home church. People would quote Jesus out of context of prophets without honor except in his own country. So when I was approached in seminary by the pastor of my home church, would I consider coming back to pastor kind of as his exit strategy? He was near retirement age. I had to kind of pray through that and work through it in my own head, because I thought, well, it makes sense. That's my home area, my home church. I know the people. I'd love to do it, but surely it can't be the will of God. It makes too much sense. So I guess philosophically, I think that we should look inside the church first instead of, when a pastor retires or there's a vacancy, immediately getting on the phone and calling places like Welch. Although we want to help people as much as possible, I think that our philosophy should be, first, let's look inward and see. We need to be developing men from within instead of relying on some external body to send us someone.
Excellent. So if you kind of go back to the first thing you said was demystify the whole call. And so we look within our church. We look at young men. We also look at older men. And one thing I'll point out, when I was going to Bible college, to Welch, there were a lot of older guys. They all carried briefcases for some reason. All the married men. And so we're talking guys in their late 20s, guys in their 30s, probably all the way up to their 50s, that had sold everything and moved off to attend college to train to minister. And so what you're saying is you look at the requirements that are there for what a pastor's to be. You look at the gifts that people have there within your church, and you're thinking, maybe this person. I wonder if you have you ever prayed about perhaps being a pastor? I think that's what I hear you saying.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when Paul told Timothy, appoint elders in every city, obviously the qualifications are always binding, but it's just like you said, there's a need. Here are the qualifications. Look for these kind of men and appoint them. He doesn't talk about waiting till they've had some kind of experience,
a Damascus Road experience.
Not to discount experience altogether, but there's nothing that I can find in the New Testament that says that kind of Damascus, to use your language, Damascus Road experience is a qualification. I think sometimes we associate the call to pastoring more so with the Old Testament call to prophet than we do maybe what the New Testament actually says about it. So I think we need both the subjective inward desire as God is working on a person sensing that, but the church, I think we need to do a much better job of coming alongside guys and suggesting, hey, have you ever thought about this? I see this potential in you, and then working with them to move them in that direction.
So we probably have a lot of pastors out there listening now, and so one of the things to think about is God still calling people into ministry? And we would think so. So look around the people there in your congregation, your flock, pray and ask God to show you. The Lord has also said, pray for folks that would go and harvest, and so you're praying about that. But you're also a lay person. You're looking around your church. You may ask and talk to people. Those of us in the ministry all had that experience. And maybe you're listening to this podcast and you've always thought that, hey, I would hear something audible. You go through and look at the requirements. You ask yourself, is this something God's calling me to do? And the scripture says in Psalm 37:4, delight yourself also in the Lord, and he'll give you the desires of your heart. So he'll put a hunger within you to do this if this is what he's calling you to do. I wanted to come back to something else you mentioned earlier, is to look inside. And so you were saying when you went to Welch that, or we won't say wherever you went, but that a lot of times people would say, well, the Lord would never call you home, and use the example of Jesus, a prophet's not really admired in his own home, but your folks started talking to you about coming back. So talk a bit about how that works. I'm whatever age I am out there pastoring a church, and I'm starting to think about the day when I could have a heart attack, I could have a stroke and be out of the ministry tomorrow. What do I need to be thinking about?
Well, I don't mean to communicate that we should never look outside. If we don't want our churches to go without pastors for a long period of time, and if there's no one inside the congregation that meets the biblical qualifications, then I think it's right, necessary, good, to call someone from outside the church. I mean, I'm currently pastoring a church I didn't grow up in, so I definitely don't want to communicate in any way that we shouldn't do that at all. I just think our default mode is to look outside first. Whereas if these networks that we have in our denomination, they're great and we ought to use them. But what if we didn't have those networks of being able to call someone from the outside? What if it was just your local church, and to have a future pastor depended on you kind of intentionally working with someone to bring them along? So, I think it makes a lot of common sense. The Bible is always pushing us in that direction to see, here's a need. I think sometimes we can over spiritualize the office to some degree, though the standards are high. I think sometimes we can over spiritualize and sometimes overthink it in terms of, you see a guy. We've got a guy in our church that's in his 50s. That's been a physical education teacher for over 25 years, and recently just talking with him through some of the stuff you mentioned earlier about, hey, I've got this desire. He'd never had this kind of time where he heard the voice of God or anything like that, really mystical, but it was just this growing desire, and then his life matches the qualifications. So just kind of bringing somebody like that
right
along and giving them opportunities to preach and teach and take them with you on visitation and things like that, and just let them see. And if in the end, if it turns out that they're not called, well, then it's no harm, no foul.
That's right. It was an experiment that didn't.
Right.
And now you found out, okay, that's not the thing. So I would challenge our folks. I don't know how much exposure people out there have to other churches, but I can go through several churches that, where I came from in North Carolina, and even the church I just left, and see a lot of transitions went very well when they went from a pastor leaving or retiring to someone that was already on staff or someone that was there within the church. And so especially when I think about what we would term successful, where churches didn't split, churches didn't lose a lot of people because of a change in philosophy or whatever.
Right.
So we really would encourage folks to look within, and then as you think about, if you're a pastor, as you think about, you're transitioning out into retirement or maybe even to another ministry, who is it that's going to take your place? We don't want to be like Hezekiah, who's like, well, everything was good in my days. No, we want to look ahead and think about what could be, how it could be better down in the future. Now, one thing I think, looking at our churches as a whole, a lot of them are going to need bivocational pastors. So some of the churches are like, well, we want a full-time pastor. Well, can you pay them? Can you support their family? Can you help them with, can you handle health insurance and their kids going to college?
Right.
And one of the things you're obviously teaching here at Welch and pastoring, so you're a bivocational pastor. So tell us a bit about your experience with that and how you see that working in the ministry.
Well, it's challenging for sure. On a positive side, I think, the community I grew up in was a blue collar community. People worked in factories, cut timber and that kind of stuff. So my first pastorate, I was full-time pastor. That's all I did. And so we would sometimes, take a lunch break about the same time the people that were the blue-collar workers did.
Yes.
And we would wind up in the same eating establishments. And sometimes you would hear one of those guys say, what have you been doing today?
Yes.
Almost to kind of poke at you a little bit, as if to say the pastors don't work very hard. So I guess what I'm getting at is that sometimes I think a bivocational pastorate kind of can open up some doors for you in terms of respect. With you know what I'm saying? Like
I do.
Some of those people,
I've been working.
I've been actually working and doing something. And I don't mean to say that pastors, who full-time pastors, aren't working.
Nor me either.
They work very hard.
Yeah.
But I think that can be a positive. To kind of turn in your favor. And my setting is a little unique because I'm in a Christian environment at Welch, but I think other guys in bivocational ministry can have evangelistic opportunities through their work and in the community and so forth. So,
and I will say, as a kid, I grew up. My pastor was David Paramore. He started out as a bivocational pastor, and it was actually apparently bivocational until I went off to college. And so it created that opportunity, but also as the ministry grew, it wasn't possible to continue in that way. But so it's a good way for folks to be able to have that in. It's probably a whole nother approach, but it's something that someone might think of as being bivocational and being an associate pastor and playing some other roles, but something for folks to kind of consider and think about.
Yes,
there.
sir.
So good. And so what you're saying, though, I think is your situation is a little different. You're teaching people about pastoring in your bivocational time. So even though you may be bivocational, you've found a way to kind of make things work together.
Most of the time, it works together. Yeah.
As much as you possibly
Yes,
can.
sir. Yeah.
So let's go back and let's think about whether a person would be bivocational or whether a person would be going into a full-time ministry, or maybe somebody's even struggling and they're wondering, am I called into the ministry? Do ministers need to be trained?
Oh man, that's a tough. That's a trick question for somebody teaching at Welch, right?
Well, it could also be a softball.
Yeah,
It could be
yeah.
a fastball down the middle, one might say.
Right. That's wrong sport for me. I need either football or basketball.
Okay.
But, I think the answer, do they need to be trained, is yes. Then the question becomes, do you mean formal, higher academic training? And then I would say, well, it depends.
So unpack that a little bit for us.
Well, the man that led me to the Lord, Tom Scott,
Yes.
pastored for over 50 years. I don't think he finished a Bible college education, but he's one of the greatest pastors, I think our denomination has seen. So, but I think, we can train people in informal ways in local churches. There's an article that Dr. Pick wrote back in the late 70s about the greatest need of our denomination was education for pastors. But he doesn't argue that all of them should come to the Bible college, but that local associations, if those can't come to the college or won't for different reasons, whether it's stage of life, finances, whatever, that local associations would really roll up their sleeves and get some kind of training in place for those pastors. On the academic side, I do think with how things have changed in America, that going off to a Bible college or getting seminary training is beneficial. I obviously think that's true, or I wouldn't be here. So.
I'm glad you said that.
But I don't think everybody has to go to a Bible college to be an effective pastor. But I do think it is extremely beneficial.
Well, and so we've all we've worked under or worked with folks that did not have the opportunity to have training or maybe formal training. One thing I do think it's important to realize is that the most important work one can do is the ministry. And, I'm all for some practical education, and think about that even like with physicians and nurses and so forth. But I kind of like that degree too. I want an MD or a OD when I go to the doctor. And so I think there's going to be some of that out there. And not negating what we can learn from practical experience and observation and so forth. But I do notice we've been on the Welch campus, and I see a lot of the younger students. I don't see a lot of those briefcases going around that we did in the 80s and probably back in the 70s and so forth. Education, you guys even have a different kind of education these days, don't you, there at Welch?
What do you mean by
Well, you've got
education?
like online education.
Oh, yes,
you've got,
yeah.
You want to talk a bit about that?
Well, I'm not in the online portion a lot. I am involved in the master's program, the master's in theology and ministry. So I think we've gotten some of those briefcase carrying people kind of in that
environment,
that group, in that environment. So we have guys and ladies, working through. They're already serving in a local church. Some of them in their 20s and 30s. Some of them, like you mentioned earlier, in 40s and 50s, 60s. So that net has kind of brought that age group in. But again, the numbers aren't what we would like for them to be, in terms of shortage and everything.
Yeah. So one thing, someone's sitting out there and they're thinking, maybe I'm called to the ministry. Well, maybe they don't have any education whatsoever. They could look at online education.
Yes, sir.
And one of the things that happens as one begins to go through some of that, they begin to get they begin to learn a lot. And just quite frankly, if you're doing Old Testament survey, you can be doing an Old Testament survey type Bible study, on a Wednesday night or Sunday night. So it does kind of work together. And then there's a lot of people that maybe they had some other kind of training. Maybe they're an engineer or whatever, a non-ministry type training. The master's degree you guys have is a way of doing that, which you wouldn't have to move away from home
yes,
to come
sir.
and do that.
Yeah, I think I went to seminary with people that had engineering degrees and different things. So I think that's, I'm trying to think of people in the program right now who fit the category you're talking about. But I know we've had some, their undergrad degrees wasn't in Bible or theology. And to go back to something about, online, one of the things that I think online students have to work really hard at is the face-to-face interaction, trying to get as much face-to-face fellowship as possible with people. One of the strengths of the grad program is we have the
modules.
week intensive where people come in. It's online for part of the program, but then they come in and they establish relationships. And
so that helps out a lot. So one thing that folks can think about, maybe you're sitting out there and you're thinking, am I called into this? Doing some training is not a bad way to kind of explore that. You're talking about other people in certain ministries you're studying, and you might even be involved in ministry somewhat where you're at, and you could take some of that and use it where you're at.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to that. You're talking about killing two birds with one stone, kind of. So if you're studying an Old Testament class, well, you got a Wednesday night study, you're a minister in a local church, then guess what you're teaching on Wednesday night? Yeah.
You want to set up a plan or a program, maybe a mentoring program within your church. That's your master's thesis, and you've got a lot of eyes looking at it, a lot of feedback along the way.
Yeah, we have a guy doing a master's project right now, and it's a strategy to revitalize his local church through discipleship. So it's real practical. So
it's a good way to go at that. Well, hey, it's so good to have you here with us today, Dr. Raper. We appreciate you stopping by, and we just pray that God will continue to be with you and will bless your ministry.
Well, thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.